On behalf of the Rancho Mirage Community Emergency Preparedness Commission, thank you for coming to our forum tonight. In a world where seemingly daily cyber attacks and cybercrime strikes and threatens our national institutions, compromise our identities, and jeopardize our personal finances, many of us seek answers on where this new digital age we live in is taking us. Our speaker tonight, James McFarlin, an author and popular national speaker on cybersecurity and cyber terrorism, is in a unique position to bring clarity to this vexing question and others. A former Air Force officer and information technology CEO who participated firsthand in 4 generations of computing, Jim currently serves as vice chair of the Rancho Mirage Emergency Preparedness Commission, where he has been instrumental in bringing a program of safe cyber security practices to our local business community. Please join me in welcoming Jim McFarlin. Jim?
Hey, thank you for coming. And I had a couple of people ask me while we were waiting to get started if this was going to be dealing with personal cybersecurity. And some of you may have been here 2 months ago. I did a whole segment on personal cybersecurity. So we're not going to touch on that tonight. We're going to touch on national cybersecurity topics. So if you wanted to hear personal stuff, you have to come back next year when we do that. When we do that again. This is my 3rd annual kind of a state of the nation in cybersecurity, national cybersecurity briefing. And so it's good to have those of you back who were here last year, and you came back in spite of the bad news that you got last year. So appreciate your staying with it. What we do is I'm going to take a look for you at just a quick review of some of the things that are going on with regard to cybersecurity, and then we're going to be talking about some things that need to be done to improve our situation. The net of it right now is that we have pretty much, our country is under assault on just about every front. I think you all know, and you see in the media the talks. In fact, almost daily there's some new data breach somewhere, and the cybercrime is soaring, as you will see. So we're, the cyber criminals are onto us, the cyber espionage and the spies are onto us, and we're just getting attacked from all fronts. And the criminals are taking hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and that's going primarily to Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Argentina, Malaysia, to the cyber syndicates. There's huge syndicates that are actually running that. And at the same time, our military, and I'll show you some of this, our military is finding that its communications is being monitored. And so we don't really know how much of what they've been talking about in terms of national defense has been compromised. And then we have something that's new this year that I didn't talk about last year because it wasn't happening, and that's the weaponization of cyberspace, where we have a whole rash of countries that are rushing to develop cyber weapons, and I don't know what they're going to do with them, but I'm not sure we want to find out. So that's kind of the big picture of where we are. My general feeling is, and I do this a lot, and my purpose is to get the word out to people that here's the situation, it's not looking really great, and most of it from a national standpoint is out of our hands, but there are some things that are happening and can happen. So I'll alert you to those, and at least you'll be able to get a view when you hear about things in the media that, hey, that makes sense. And maybe things like, you're probably all familiar with the FBI versus Apple fight, the dog fight. Okay, so putting that in perspective, and you can ask me more about that at question and answer if you want. But things like that, we want to put them in perspective. So let's take a look just quickly at the See if this works here. Cybercrime. And last year, this is something it's obviously not easy to totally count, but it's estimated as $525 billion changed hands globally in cybercrime, which makes it larger than the global drug trade. Gives you an idea of how much money is changing hands. So it's not just the little amounts, and I'll show you some examples where there's some large amounts. And we'll run through and look at just a couple of the kind of what I would say the showcase cases where these organizations perhaps really shouldn't have lost their information, but they did. JP Morgan is considered to be the gold standard for cybersecurity protection in the financial services industry. They have around 3,000 people that are in cybersecurity, and just to put that in perspective, 20 years ago they had 6. They have 3,000 people. They spend $250 million a year on cybersecurity, and yet they had 83 million customer records, individual records, business records stolen, and they only found out about it by accident in spite of all those expenditures. So what they're going to do, their solution is they're going to double their staff to 6,000. They're going to double their expenditures to $500 million. And hopefully they can keep this from happening again. Now, I have some cynical friends in the business who are kind of saying, well, it sounds like JP Morgan is doubling down on something that doesn't work. And so let's just hope that they're spending that money in a way that is different. So the key points there is they had some amazing technology to protect themselves, and it didn't stop the criminals. And secondly, they didn't find out about it except by accident from an outside firm. Anthem, and I know there's a lot of people in this room probably who are affected by the Anthem theft. There's over 100 million healthcare records stolen, and healthcare records are more valuable on the market than, say, a credit card, because healthcare records, a credit card can be changed, it can be canceled, and it can be replaced. Healthcare records are healthcare records, and they pretty much stay the way that they are. So they bring a premium on the market. Give you an example. If your MasterCard information is stolen on the black market, it will fetch anywhere from $1 to $3. Healthcare, your healthcare record will fetch somewhere between $50 and $200. And so you're starting to see more and more activity, and I'll show you some examples in the healthcare segment. But Anthem got hit very hard. Something that's jumped up a lot recently is the IRS theft. They lost 700,000 tax records last year, and basically the people who had their information stolen, many of them found that when they went to file their tax returns, that someone had already filed their returns for them and claimed a refund. So when they went to file their taxes, the IRS said, you've already filed and you got your refund. And so that can take 1 or 2 years to sort back out. IRS is not the sharpest blade on the block here. And so the IRS could not stop this. And we're seeing more and more of the tax record theft. I just saw a report yesterday where there's over 50 companies just in the last month have reported that they have coughed up W-2 information. They were scammed out of it. They were tricked into giving up the W-2 information. And so those are tax records that can be used. It's bad. And then the cash transfer schemes, they happen to us, but they happen to large organizations, large corporations, and I'll show you one in a second. They're very difficult to stop, and they don't come through always the firewalls and the protective systems. They will come in over the transom, and some unsuspecting employee will click on something they shouldn't click on, open something they shouldn't open, and it's going to let the criminals in, and that happens over and over again. So this phishing is a big business, and unless we really pay attention, everybody's vulnerable. Now, this was kind of an interesting case. Does everybody know what LifeLock is? Okay. So they, personal identity monitoring. They were fined 6 months ago by the Federal Trade Commission $100 million for not protecting the information that we give them to protect ourselves. Now that's rather circular, but it's also rather scary. Now they didn't lose any information, so if you use their service, you didn't lose anything. But what the FTC was concerned about was that their practices would leave them vulnerable. And after 2 years of warnings and that they didn't heed, LifeLock, they finally said, guess what? We think this will get your attention. How's $100 million? Well, it got a lot of people's attention because their stock dropped 50% in 34 minutes. Big deal. This one is kind of a new one. We haven't seen a lot of this. $101 million from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York transferred directly out. So why go through individuals? Why go through companies? Why go through scams? Just take it right out of the bank. Get it over with, transfer it over to Malaysia, and spend it as you will. So they managed to catch this. It was set up to yield about $1 billion, and they caught it in process, and were able to stop it. It was only $101 million, but somebody has to replace, and I don't know who's responsible. Now, the Sony Hack, everybody here probably remembers the Sony Hack. It was a little bit different. This was not a theft for money. This was to go in, damage the computers, take out the networks, take out the email, and make public, 4 admittedly bad movies. And in return, they wanted, Sony not to release the film that had to do with the assassination of the head of North Vietnam. And so this just gives an example, and North Korea was blamed for this, and really nothing was done. What can you do? I mean, they don't really have an internet themselves. But I also know that I sat in 2 other briefings, one of which, and they're both totally believable, one of which had absolutely conclusive evidence that it was the Russians that did this, not North Korea. And another one had absolute conclusion that it was an insider. So, it's very difficult then to give retribution to somebody if you're not really sure they're the ones who did it. So it gets to be a little bit tricky. You may have seen recently the Presbyterian Memorial Hospital in Los Angeles was held for ransom. Anybody see that? Their systems were basically frozen, and the deal is here is you're held for ransom. You give us some money, usually bitcoins. You give us some money, and we will free your systems back up again. Now, in the meantime, while they're negotiating all of this, they basically, at the hospital, they have no systems. They can't, oncology and other departments like that require computers to operate, they're closed. All the records, the records of everybody that's in the hospital are not available. The doctors have no access to provide treatment with. And so it gets ugly really, really fast. And so what happens, this has happened again to 10 hospitals in the Washington, Baltimore area a couple of weeks later. Same thing all over again, ransom, systems frozen. And it's very difficult to deal with it. The FBI hates to say this publicly, but basically they're telling the hospitals, you just have to pay up because it's very difficult to turn this around. So it's a good source of funds for the criminals. Now this gives you a picture of, I mentioned to you that healthcare hacks, healthcare breaches are accelerating. They're one of the newer areas because they're so lucrative. The information that they get, your health records are so valuable, much better than your credit card information. This is a chart just came out, is in the state of California, and it shows, I can get this to work. In 2009, there were 8 incidents affecting 25,000 individuals that went along to 196,000 individuals that had records compromised in 2014. Look at 2015. 4.6 million people. And this does not include the Presbyterian hospital I was just mentioning. That happened in 2016. This is a big, big problem, and it's going to cost the hospitals a lot of money. So the net of all this is that the cybercrime business is extraordinarily lucrative, and it is projected to quadruple by the end of the decade to somewhere between 1 and 2 trillion, depending on which estimate that you listen to. And so that's up from 525 billion up to this. So it is huge, and we are unable to stop it. So who knows how far it can go. And this is really, it's scary as we get talking about national security issues, that we have all of these attacks that continue and they cannot be stopped in spite of all the tremendous amount of money that's spent. Now let's talk a little bit about what to me is the most alarming development I have ever seen in the whole internet cyberspace activity, and that is this weaponization. Right now there are, by some counts, there are 29 countries that are actively developing or purchasing, you can purchase them, offensive cyber weapons. They're building these huge arsenals of these cyber weapons. And so this is a very challenging problem because, you know, it's one thing having for example, detente between us and Russia, where, you know, we have the standoff because we have the missiles and they have the missiles, and the saying there is that the one who shoots first dies second, you know, but you will die. And so you have a standoff where the people don't shoot. When there's 29 countries, just to use that number, and you have people that really aren't experienced in using these new attack methods, and we don't know, they all have different motives, and some really don't care if they get wiped out, i.e. Terrorist groups, then you have a recipe for a real problem. And that to me is the number one thing that we've got to look out, you know, moving forward. The net of that is the front lines of all of this is right here. We're not talking about fighting a war in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or South China Sea. We're talking about it all happening here. And that is what makes it very, very tough, because we can't always defend, yet they're bringing the weapons, you know, to us. We'll look at a few things that happen there in this national security space. One is that every single top weapon system that we have developed in the last 10 to 15 years has been stolen. Now this is the F-35 supersonic fighter that just came out. And it is a flying computer center. The thing is unbelievable. And the plans for this were gone over 10 years ago. They were taken. And if you look at this, the F-35, if you look at the new, and we believe China took these plans, if you look at the new Chinese J-31 fighter, and you hold up the picture to the F-35, you can't tell them apart. So what have we done? We have become the R&D for China's arsenal of weapons development. And this is true for aircraft carriers, satellites, everything that we've developed. And you say, well, how can they get those? That's the Defense Department. It isn't the Defense Department. The Defense Department does not build these weapons. These are built by private contractors, Lockheed, companies like that, and they have tens of thousands of suppliers who have various levels of cybersecurity in place. It only takes one of those to be opened for criminals to come on in and take it. This is bad news for us. The Department of the Navy, I mentioned that we have some communication of our military communications, some monitoring of our military communications going on. The Navy, the Department of the Navy had all of its internal communications monitored for a year before they knew about it. They didn't know about it. And then it took them 5 months to get it unraveled. And that, you kind of say, well, what information did they lose? And no one really knows. The NASDAQ, this happened a couple of years ago, where there was signs of invasion of the NASDAQ trading system, and there was no disruption, there was no destruction, but there was monitoring going on. And you say, why is this monitoring going on? And some people who, in the military background, that one of the first things you do before you do an attack is you have reconnaissance. You go out and you get a lay of the land before you do your attack. Well, the bombs, so to speak, that were in there were collecting data. And so they've been going on for who knows how long. And it took months to get those back out. Those went in undetected and were there for who knows how long. That's the scary part, undetected. Many of you may remember the Stuxnet attack, where supposedly the United States and Israel attacked the Iranian centrifuges. Remember that? All right. And the Iranians didn't like that, obviously. So they mounted some counterattacks. And one of the things they did a couple of years ago was they brought down the banking networks of a lot of the big banks in New York City, so that you had no access to your account. You couldn't get money out of an ATM. You couldn't find out what your balances were. You couldn't basically do anything. And then they also, and this was just disclosed recently, they also got inside of a dam in upper New York, just outside of New York City, where they were into the internal controls of this dam, where they could have actually controlled, opened, closed, whatever. And so those people were traced down to Iran, and there's, listen to this. This is real retribution. So we put out indictments for their arrest. Well, I doubt that Iran is going to send them back. I really don't. But we do have these seven gentlemen. They're all men who worked on that. So again, these couldn't be stopped. And any of you who have been in the military ever, or worked for the government ever, had your personnel records stolen through the Office of Personnel Management, and along with your fingerprints, by the way. And also, if you applied for top security clearance, those forms are very long, all of that information is gone. So the Chinese, again, we're blaming the Chinese because they're really good at this. The Chinese have that information on 21.5 million Americans, including many of whom are active intelligence officers, active military people, not just former people. And that was a case where the Inspector General of the Office of Personnel Management 3 years in a row gave the organization a failing grade in cybersecurity and said, you got to clean up your act, and they never did. And so this is what happened, and then the woman who heads that organization was retired early at full retirement, but she's gone. And again, this is very serious stuff because we got our personal information. I'm former military. Our information, what are they going to do with that? And it's just kind of scary. Now, ISIS is known for its use of social media for what? Recruitment, training, radicalization, fundraising. They're one of the more sophisticated users of social media, and primarily Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, but they use them all. And in the world, they are absolutely phenomenal. I have seen some demonstrations of some of their sites for fundraising. Looks like it came out of Madison Avenue, and these things are slick, they're great videos, and it's kind of along the model of the Wounded Warrior, where you give $19 a month and you can support one of the ISIS fighters, or you can buy a weapon for them, or you can send them food. And it's a huge fundraising thing, and it goes on all around the world, and these websites that do this are in all these different languages. And so they exist. And every time we try and put one out, another one pops up. It's very difficult. The scary thing about ISIS is, and no one knows for sure what's going on, but they are pursuing the development of offensive cyber weapons. And if keep in mind, most of the people in ISIS, they're young men in their 20s, so they grew up in the internet generation. They know the internet. They know technology. So to be able to do this type of thing is easy for them. So who knows how long until they have some offensive weapons and they can bring them over here. But it's scary. The 23rd of December last year, something happened that never happened before, and that is the Ukrainian power grid was brought down, or at least a large portion of it. And it occurred over a 4-hour period. All of the power stations were just one by one turned off, and the people in the control center in the Ukraine, this is the Western Ukraine, not the Russian side, they were in the control center and had lost control of their computer monitors, and they could see the cursor going around, turning off all these different power stations. It took 3 or 4 hours. There's nothing they could do to stop it until there were 225,000 people in the dead of winter without power. Now, the thing that saved them is that their systems are older in the Ukraine, and they had manual backups. So they could actually send people out and do a manual override, and over a period of several days, we're able to get the power back. But if you are in a situation where you're more modern, like we are, then you say, I don't have that backup. What am I going to do? And the system could go out. So one of the things that was really scary was notices went out to all of our utility companies that this had happened in Ukraine and that these methods could be used on them. So we got 1,950 some odd utility power companies with 3,800 facilities generating power. And they all have various standards of cybersecurity. And so to expect them to all kind of jump up and salute and take care of this was a little much. But nonetheless, they were warned. But the threat is still there, is could those methods that were used in Ukraine be used against us? And here's what brings it all together when we're looking at these threats. One is that bringing down a power grid is really like a weapon of mass destruction, because you're shutting off power, you're shutting off communication, you're shutting off heat, light, whatever, to people, and that's very dangerous over a period of time. Second, our targets in our power grid, people, as I mentioned, they all march to a different drummer, various levels of cybersecurity. Generally speaking, they're all vulnerable. And then third is the defenses we have across the board don't work. And if you take all that together, it's a catastrophe waiting. And hard to say when that might happen and if it might happen, but if it does, then we're looking at some consequences like this that get ugly very, very quickly. And I don't need to go through all of them, but I'm sure everybody in this room, all of you have been through power outages for a couple of hours, maybe even a couple of days. But after a couple of days, it gets really, really dicey. It's not a lot of fun. And so when we're talking about an extended outage where you've got 5 days, 10 days, 2 weeks, which in our case would be the case, then things really, really get difficult. And I know, for example, Eisenhower Hospital here, they have a case of emergency and disaster. They have a lockdown plan in place. People say, I'll just go to the hospital if I need care. You're not getting any care. They lock it down. They have a triage group outside on the lawn. They have one entrance only, and you only get in if you're critical. If you're not, you go home, because they can't. They're full. They can't do it. So they're turning away people who need medical care. And if we need medicines and you need medical treatment or any of that, it's generally not available. The first responders are going to what? They're going to run out of fuel. Their fire trucks, their police cars, their ambulances, will last until their gas tanks are empty, and then they cannot refill them because you can't get gas out of the ground. It takes a pump. Pump takes electricity. And so within several days, first responders will be non-existent in terms of bringing help to you. So the biggest asset here, as I mentioned, is social currency. And what that means is when you have a case where there's no power, there's no communications, you don't have supplies of food, you don't have your medicine, you don't have health care, you can't go any place unless you have a bicycle, is the thing that's most valuable is your neighbors, your family, and your friends. And that's one of the primary reason in the back, as you came in today, you probably got some materials on a program called Map Your Neighborhood. And this is where neighborhoods get together, they communicate on what their collective needs are in case of a disaster, an emergency, and they realize that the first responders are really not going to be there for them necessarily. And they come together and help each other, and they come up with a plan to do that. So Map Your Neighborhood is a nationwide effort. It's done with groups of homes. We just had one in our community where we did. And it is very, very valuable. So I say to you, if you, we cannot control if that power grid goes out because somebody decided to use the Ukrainian tools to do it. We cannot control that. Only thing we can control is what is it that we do to prepare and respond to it. So I encourage you, if you haven't been back to the back to get some of that information on the Map Your Neighborhood, you do so. And also, if while you're waiting to map your neighborhood, if you need some emergency supplies, obviously Alan's got some really good stuff back there in terms of radios and water and all that type of thing. So take care of yourself, because when something big like this happens, you're going to be the one taking care of things. A question then comes up, is this really going to happen? Jim's talking about that scenario, and it really doesn't sound good, but, there's a lot of ambivalence, there's a lot of denial out there. So I don't know the answer, but I do know someone who knows more about cybersecurity defenses and offensive weapons than anybody in this country, and that's Admiral Michael Rogers here, who's the head of the NSA. He is also the head of the U.S. Cyber Command, which develops offensive cyber weapons. And he lives and breathes this stuff. And he gave a talk recently, and he repeated it at Congress, that he said he's 2 years into, depending on who the next president is, he's 2 years into a 4 to 6 year term, okay, in terms of his being in that position. And what he said was that as far as he's concerned, the critical national infrastructure, which is the power, water, communications, transportation, those things, it's not a question of whether any of those are going to get hit. It's only a question of when. And he expects one of those things to have a major attack before he completes his term of duty. So that puts it somewhere in the 2 to 3 year time frame. Now, this is not someone who, he's not selling a book about this. He has nothing to gain. He doesn't have a TV show where he's trying to get ratings up. He's trying to do his job and protect America. And he is stating honestly what he feels. And it's pretty scary to hear him say that. Now, there are people who disagree. There's people who disagree. And I'll show you one right now. Jeh Johnson is the Secretary of Homeland Security. And some of you may have heard of a relatively new book now from Ted Koppel called Lights Out. Anybody heard of that? That talk, yeah. And so it's kind of a, what would you call it, a documentary? What would you call it? Yeah, documentary, okay. My book's a novel, but his is a documentary. And it's you can follow the journey of Ted Koppel at the beginning, where he was real curious about this cyber stuff and what's going on. And by the end of the book, he was terrified. His own reporting. And so he had access to, obviously, top people all around the country, around the world. And one of the people he talked to was the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Jeh Johnson, and was in there in his office. And this is in the book. It's fascinating. This is worth buying the book. You remember this segment where he's talking with Jeh Johnson and a couple of Johnson's aides about Secretary Johnson, what is your plan for a massive cyber attack that takes down the power grid? What would you do? And Johnson said, and I'm quoting from the book, I'm not making this up, he says, well, I'd call FEMA. Okay, and so Koppel is not one to let people off the hook, And so he said, well, can you be a little more specific about that? Do you have a plan somewhere? And so evidently, Secretary Johnson pointed up, he had some white binders up on a bookcase on his wall. He says, well, I'm sure there's a plan up there somewhere. And so then, as Koppel proceeded with his questioning, and the answers weren't forthcoming, and and then one of the other people who was in there was a technology person in Homeland Security, and so finally that person, they didn't have any answers, and finally that person spoke up, and she said, Mr. Koppel, we just basically don't believe that it's going to happen, and therefore we're not planning for it. Now that's our Homeland Security Department that is there to protect us. Okay, you can put a big X through them as long as Mr. Johnson is there, because he's not making it work. Now, 18 months ago, you may know this, there was an update to the 9/11 Commission report by the original authors. They wanted to take a look, with some perspective on what had changed since the time that they issued the report, and give a report on. So they published an update, and one of the things that they mentioned that was really key, and I'm quoting here, was that one lesson from 9/11 is that we didn't awaken to the gravity of the terrorist threat until it was too late, and we must not repeat that in the cyber realm. And I think that's something that, I kind of feel like it would be really nice to frame that and send it to Secretary Johnson and say, put that on your wall. Because again, these two gentlemen, they have nothing to gain from, whoop-ah. They're just trying to say, here's what we can do to protect America. Now, let me give you a couple of challenges and then we'll wrap up. There are some things that need to be pursued if we're going to turn any of this around. Now, the first one we can only pursue by the passage of time, and that's called a generation gap. Generation gap, what I'm referring to, is that the people in positions of power, whether those be corporate executives, whether they be people running government agencies, politicians, they tend to be, they're typically not 20-year-olds unless you're Mark Zuckerberg or something. They tend to be, 50s and so on and so forth. And so they're the ones that are making the decisions on how to deal with all these cyber threats, and they don't have a clue how to do it. And all the people who do understand are in their 20s. They're what you can call, cyber natives. They grew up with the internet, whereas most of us, we came into it. We did not grow up with it, and we're just not as comfortable as they are. And it's kind of like having one of your grandchildren over and say, "Oh, thank God they're here. They can fix my computer." It's that type of thing. And so you have a real mismatch here in this generation, in that you have people making rules, Congress passing laws, politicians coming up with ideas, and corporations putting in defenses for things that they don't understand. And so the people that do understand are somewhere in the basement, and they're not heard. So until this gets itself worked out, until we have the people who are in their 20s and 30s moving up to where they are now running these organizations, we'll never really be able to understand what it is that needs to be done. Now, and I think case in point, the current presidential cycle, the circus that's going on, there's not a candidate there who really addresses, I'm not sure there's a candidate that addresses at all this whole cyber threat issue. They may have a position on encryption or not, but they really don't. And they're, my guess, I have no idea, if Donald Trump may be an expert in cybersecurity, for all I know. But he has friends who are, even if he's not, They're not addressing this, and I think part of the reason is they don't understand it. And so it's very difficult to stand up and talk about something if they don't understand it, or propose legislation, or. So the generation gap will only happen when you can't legislate your way out of that. It's going to take time. So that will happen if we last that long. Second is the intelligence rebuild. And what I'm talking about, I think you're all familiar with the Edward Snowden leaks, where he put out this information on the NSA, went out, did a lot of damage, and it's caused a crimping of the NSA's intelligence gathering networks. Crimping meaning they can't do as much as they used to, and there's just a lot of people. This is back to the privacy versus security issue. A lot of people are saying, no, they're spying on us and they're listening to our phone calls. I'm sorry, I don't think your phone call is that interesting where they need to listen to your phone call. And they weren't. They were listening to what's called the metadata, which is where the phone connects. Anyway, so their powers were reduced, and they reduces our ability to stop these attacks. And here's how. If you look at the cyber attack cycle, I'll just go ahead and put these up here. I put it into 3 phases. You can do it how you want. The first is preventing an attack before it occurs. And let me come back to this. The second is defending once it's started. Now, I hope if I have done nothing tonight except give you examples of how our, whoops, see, this is high tech here. So much for my finger here. There you go. Our defenses aren't real good, are they? They're not really working very, very well at any level. So what happens is most of our organizations are spending their time in the recovery mode. In other words, the target stores that got hit 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, they have over 100 lawsuits pending against them. They're going to be litigating forever. So that's called recovering. They've got to get new systems. They've got to get new security procedures. They've got to get rid of people. They've got to add some new people. They've got to spend more money. You've got to be JP Morgan double thing. Let's spend $500 million. Let's hire 3,000 people. Let's get more software. All this stuff. So they spend all these resources in recovery. Those don't move the ball down the field. All that does is kind of get you back to where you were. And that's because this doesn't work real well. What can work is the prevention if you have what? The intelligence to know when things are being developed. If we had known what those Paris terrorists were talking about, if we had known what the San Bernardino people were doing with their iPhone, if we had known, we might have been able to prevent some of those deaths. And put that on a national level and a global level, really, and you can see the importance of intelligence. And I know a lot about the NSA. I did not serve there, and I have not been there, but I know a lot about it. And I can guarantee you, all the people I know who I've come in contact with, they are not interested in stealing our information. They're interested in stopping attacks. And I think we should all be much more concerned about the information that we give to Facebook and Google, and Amazon, because we cough up everything to them. They know our buying habits. They know where we're located. They know where we're traveling. Our phones tell them exactly where we are. I mean, there were people that were in Paris, Americans that were there, and after those attacks occurred, they got a message from Facebook on their phone that said, "Are you okay?" That's really scary. So I personally think that there's more to worry about than the NSA, and we have to restore that prevention step and build our intelligence network if we're going to try and stop some of these. Now, this is not going to happen until we have a change of administration, which is coming up, and it will depend on who occupies the White House, because this is a leadership role that says, here's how we're going to protect the country. So we'll see, what would Donald Trump do? What would Hillary Clinton do? Who knows? We really don't know. In fact, both of those are scary options. So you can keep this in perspective when we're talking about, you read about all these attacks that succeed. They failed the defensive mode, but before that, the prevention didn't happen. Paris happened because we didn't have the intelligence prevention. San Bernardino, the list goes on and on and on. And it's really important that we have that. And the ability is there to collect this information. Everything is digitized. Everything is on the internet. Everything is available. And people worry about privacy. I think the best quote I've seen is, privacy is dead, get over it. And just move on with your life. Don't, if you don't want to have privacy, don't get on the internet. So, very key. Next thing is this public-private role shift. Now, historically, if we go back, let's go back to the Cold War. So we've got a country, we've got industry, we've got power grids, we've got people, and we've got Russia that's got missiles. And so our military, our government is funding these missiles and these defensive fighters and these long-range bombers and these reconnaissance satellites and early warning to protect what? To protect our assets as a country and our people. When it comes to cyber attacks, the government doesn't do that. 90% of the infrastructure, again, we're talking water, power, communications, transportation, that critical infrastructure is run by the private sector, and the government is saying to them, and this is Ashton Carter, who's the Secretary of Defense, and he gave a talk, it's been a year now, it doesn't seem like, a talk at Stanford University to some business executives, and he was very clear. And what he said to them was, when it comes to cybersecurity of your organizations, we can't help you, you're on your own. So this is a switch of roles, is it not? In other words, we used to say, the military will take care of it, the missiles will stop the Russians, and we're going to keep the bad guys at bay over in Iran or wherever. And those roles have changed. The government doesn't have the capability to protect our private infrastructure, nor do they believe it is the government's mission as stated by Mr. Carter. So that role switch has to be facilitated, and one of the best ways is to have a team approach where you've got them working together. Now, at a local level, when Dennis Miletti was up here, in the introduction, he mentioned that I've been involved in working with local businesses and implementing cybersecurity. And that's a public-private partnership. That involves the City of Rancho Mirage, the Emergency Preparedness Commission, of which I'm a part, and it involves the Chamber of Commerce for Rancho Mirage. And we provide, my team from the commission goes out and we talk to businesses and say, we have a training program for your employees that is free to you, it's paid for by the City of Rancho Mirage, that will reduce your risks of cybercrime markedly, 50 to 80%. And here's how you can gain access to it. That's a public-private partnership, and that's done at a local level, and this is unique. We don't know of nowhere else in California is this being done. But at a national level, the same thing applies. We have to do that. And then finally is the subject of deterrence. And I mentioned earlier the missile deterrence, the mutually assured destruction with the Russians in the Cold War. That was real deterrence because one goes, the other one goes. Deterrence can be defined in a number of ways, but a lot of it is a show of force. It's a show of an intent to use power. And so, for example, there's a couple of things going on right now. China is building on these islands in the South China Sea. They're putting missiles out there in the airfields. And they're taking a piece of rock that isn't necessarily even theirs, and they're saying it is ours because this is China. And they're putting all these military installations that have power. And so we, the only way, unless we are to go in there and try and take those, which you can't do, the show of force with the Sixth Fleet, the Fifth Fleet going in there and cruising through there, planes flying over those facilities saying, guess what, China, we're here. Now that's a deterrent. We didn't drop any bombs, we didn't fire any missiles or anything, but they know that we're there. And the same thing with the NATO exercises that are going on right now. The whole purpose is to show Mr. Putin that NATO has these forces that are circling him, and they will be used if necessary. And so those exercises is a method of deterrence. In the cyber world, we have no deterrence because there's no policy. There is no show of force. The use of offensive cyber weapons, if we were to do that, is a decision of the President of the United States. It's not something military commanders come up with. So, they don't get used. And we do have weapons. We have very, very strong weapons. From what I understand, if we want to take out the lights in Russia, we can. China, we can. North Korea, we can. Well, North Korea doesn't have any lights, but we can take out other places. So we have those powers, but we're not going to do it any more than China is going to take out our power grid. And if they take out our power grid, China takes out our power grid, think of the consequences. We're their biggest customer. Who's going to buy all their stuff? They got to send all that stuff to Walmart. So they're not going to do that. And Russia the same way. Russia's not going to take down our power grid because if we found out about it, we would retaliate in some other more severe ways, I'm sure. But a bunch of the other people we don't really know, and they don't know because we have been very timid about our responses to attacks. We're timid about the taking down of the ATMs in New York and the banking system. We were timid about the Sony attack. We were timid about the dam. We gave some indictments. And so that is not a sign of deterrence. That's a sign of weakness. And so until that gets turned around, these four things are going to cause us trouble. And I think they're all addressable, but they're not addressable overnight. The thing that is missing here too, that we've had a couple of cases in our past. One is the development of the atomic bomb. World War II, there's a big rush, as you know, with the Manhattan Project to get the bomb before Hitler made it, because they figured once he got it, it was over, right? So there's a big rush. There was a fear. It drew people together and said, we've got to get this made. Another one that happened more recently in the 50s was, you know what this is? Sputnik. Yeah. Most people here are not old enough to remember it, but that's Sputnik. Was it 1957? I mean, I was just a child. And that was that was scary. It was really scary because although we had been developing, space programs, we didn't have anything like that. We couldn't put anything in outer space, in inner space. And so that was a galvanizing effect. And it caused us to come together and actually do something as a public-private enterprise. And that answer was the Apollo program, which involved obviously the government, universities, research institutes, and over 100,000 private companies from around the world made that work to put a man on the moon in a little less than a decade and bring them back. That is that was the largest private-public partnership in the history of the world before or since. If we had that sense of urgency for the cyber threats, if we had that sense of coming together with the cyber threats, we wouldn't be having this discussion and you wouldn't have to come to these presentations. Just think of all the extra time you'd have. It'd be good. So that type of partnership has to be somehow put together. And the question is, can we do it? Will we do it? That's a question that we don't know, but I think it's the direction we need to go. So the answer to that is we don't know, but we'll have an update in 2017. That's why they say, someone say, what did you do last night? I went and heard some guy talk about cybersecurity. Well, what are we supposed to do? He said, well, he didn't know. So hopefully we'll have some more answers if we actually are still able to get together and have lights, in 2017. And that is my assessment for 2016. Thank you.